Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Hysterical Ideology and Art's Historical Cure. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was, upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. Wallace Stevens, Anecdote of the Jar. Hi everybody, and the good news today is you're going to see very little of my ugly mug. I'm going to be showing you quite a lot of images. And there's two things I wanted to say right from the off. What I hope to achieve today, you can judge me by whether I achieve it or not, is first of all get you to see that poem by Wallace Stevens I started with in a different light, or if you've never come across it before, to get some insight into it after you've seen it for the first time. And secondly, I hope that after this talk you will have some type of appreciation, hopefully positive, for this painting and of the work of Jean Fautrier, which I'm going to be going through in the talk. And I've put the little title there, Cowpats, in context, because this is the typical response to paintings like this from Fautrier, and it looks like a cowpat. You know, I don't like that type of art. I know what I like and I like what I know, and that's not it type of response. And it made me think that we live in times that are incredibly ideological, and this is the type of art which I'm going to trace in this talk that I'm going to suggest goes right back to prehistoric cave paintings, the influence, the inspiration for this type of painting. And the argument I want to present to you, and this is what you need to let me know in the comments whether I succeed at all, is to appreciate art like this, it really helps to understand context. And once you understand the context, what it's trying to achieve, where it came from, the historical context within which it was made, some of the allusions it's making, all of these quite complicated factors, it adds just different dimensions, and suddenly it's not something that just looks like a cowpat. But we live in a society where that's, photography and video dominated, therefore there isn't much context often beyond the immediate visual image. And increasingly with cancel culture, there is a growing social pressure to cancel things in terms of historical context because it's deemed to be too upsetting or triggering. So it was interesting with the recent talk I did on Picasso. There was a little bit of pushback by the occasional person. Picasso was a very nasty man. And then they went on to say he wasn't a very good artist, which I just think is, laughable. But the idea that someone's a bad person, therefore you cancel engagement with their art, I just think is a crazy idea. But also recently in Britain, that they're taking off famous faces off banknotes in the near future. They're going to put we don't really have wildlife in the UK anymore, but they're going to put animals on the front. And I think they're doing some type of public consultation to see what type of animals people want. And they're taking off, Churchill always gets a kicking, and Shakespeare, they've been taken off banknotes because, in the interests of diversity and inclusion, you can't have historical figures from your own country's culture. But anyway, before I go off on one, this notion of context, it's to do with the background, literally and metaphorically, to paintings that I think is, really important. So just to let you have a look at this in more clear detail without me distracting you. And I'll be explaining as we go along, but this is, I'm terrified of pronouncing French now because you know who you are in the comments, Emma. My French pronunciation, I can't even say it in English now. My French pronunciation was, I've been informed, is awful. But this is tête d'otage, which translated means head of hostage, a hostage. And it was a series of paintings Jean Fautrier did about hostages taken by the Gestapo in Paris at the time when the Germans were occupying. And I'll give you more of the background in a second. But so this is, he did a series which I'll be showing you loads of images from this series that was just known as the Hostage series. So this was, I think this is number 18 from 1945. And this is from the thumbnail. And why all this relates to the concept of ideology is that I think it doesn't matter whether you're left or right on the political spectrum. I think we can all agree, I'm trying to find some common ground, that we live in increasingly ideological times. And this lady became a meme. I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that this was Donald Trump, the Donald's first inauguration. And this lady found it difficult to accept that 50% of her fellow citizens disagreed with her. So she had a bit of an epic emotional meltdown. A few things I'd say about this concept of ideology is, one, we're all trapped by it. I think it's a complete supercilious myth to think that any of us are any better than anyone else and we have a completely non-ideological view on the world. We all have an ideological perspective. It's inescapable as part of the human condition. The question I want to pursue throughout the rest of this video is, to what extent does art at least make you more open to the nuance and subtlety and ask you to question your own worldview? I've mentioned him in previous videos, but there's an American philosopher, Richard Rorty, and he had this quite interesting way of thinking about it. He referred to the final vocabulary, was I think the phrase he used, to describe that we all argue as rationally as we can, but ultimately our own personal ideologies reach a point where, like a child saying to their parent, why, and at the end of a long series of whys, the parent often resorts to, because I say so. And Rorty makes the point that no matter how rational we try to be, ultimately in any discussion or debate, you quite often quickly get to the point where you've just reached the end, and that is your emotional commitment, your ideological viewpoint. And that, I think, is how ideology affects us all, even if we think it doesn't. So what I wanted to do was contrast that type of emotional, for an adult, this strikes me as she has the emotional maturity of a spoilt 4-year-old. And it made me think of the Fautrier paintings. And I will accept from the get-go, I could have taken a completely different route, but there's a reason I'll explain as we go along. I wanted to pursue the prehistoric aspect of all this. But this, I think, this is on the right-hand side, obviously, it's the Odessa step scene from the famous film Battleship Potemkin by Eisenstein from 1925. It's just a very epic image, very resonant image that you could compare to our screaming Trump derangement syndrome person. It's just, for a movie still, it's a work of art in and of itself. And when I say that, it was a huge influence on Francis Bacon. So this is a detail from it. The painting was called Study for the Nurse from the Battleship Potemkin. And Francis Bacon painted this in 1957. So you can see how he had a photograph of the Potemkin scene in his studio that's constantly by one of his easels. That's the original full. And I have done little bits on Francis Bacon in the past, but I'd like to do more. And the way he has boxes and lines surrounding human figures, it's the circumscription of bodies. It's really interesting. Right, I think this is the last time you'll see my Fizzog on screen. But this is the person I want to focus on, the artist, to draw out this concept of ideology and contrast it with the hysterical ideology you've just seen from that woman who can't, basically she's emotionally incontinent, she needs emotional diapers. But this, I'm not sure how well known he is, because I've liked him for a long time, but I don't think he's had that much exposure. Definitely not the level of exposure I think he deserves. I won't go into, and maybe at another time, if there's any interest, and this is a vaguely successful video, I'll happily do more on Fautrier. But French born, but he went to spend time in London, and then he was called back to fight in the First World War. He was called up, but he had very ill health, so I don't think he took part at the front. But he did play active service in the war. And what I'd like to emphasize is it was I'll show you some paintings before 1940, but I want to treat 1940 as a key date in his lifetime. Because in 1940, this happened. It's a fascinating backstory. There were 4 young kids, and I think this is a trivia question if you're ever in a quiz. I think the dog they were with was called Robot, but they were just fooling around in the French woods, as kids do, just playing, and they discovered the entrance to a cave, and they went down, and it was they're known as the Lascaux caves, and this was 1947. The photographs are by a guy called Ralph Morse, who worked for Life magazine. So this is the crew he had down there, and in the background you can see the locals, the French locals, being able to see. These kids were the first people who'd seen these cave paintings, which they estimate are about 20,000 years old. So imagine you're a young kid and you get to see these for the first time. But obviously under the lights they're even more impressive, because it's obviously incredibly dark down there. I think sat down in the foreground is Ruth Morse. It was the wife of Ralph Morse. And there's obviously a whole crew of people who worked on taking photographs. And this is one of the very tight chambers. And it's obviously artificial, because these are all lit up by the lights they lugged all the way down from, high above. So you'd get to see images like this the way they were originally made, just by very primitive, what would you call it, mental lapse. I can't think of the word they use for those primitive lights. Not torches. Yeah, torches, but not electric, obviously. So you've got to play in. I'm going to do more on this in future probably, but there's the whole thing about in the dark, and the way in which the shadows work when you have old-fashioned fire torches deep within the ground in primitive times. And there's some theories that they're off their heads on hallucinogens, and this was all part of the process. They painted what came up from their subconscious, but that's for another time. And I love this. This is a guy, one of the crew that went down to take the photos, just looking at one of the horses. And obviously the health and safety wasn't a big deal in those days, so he's smoking. And they've eventually had to close down because the number of people, the carbon dioxide people gave off visiting, looking at these images, started to damage the wall paintings, which were in amazingly good condition considering how old they are. So they've made replicas underneath the ground. It's like different galleries. I think it's 3 or 4 by now. Different variations, and they've replicated on the walls these paintings. But this is the original. And this is from the Bull Hall. It's called the Great Black Bull. And why I'm showing you is because this is, if you keep this in your mind's eye, This is Nu Couché, 1929 by Fautrier, and it's 1929, and that's obviously an important date because I'm going to be showing you paintings as we go along that I'm arguing were influenced by the discovery of these in 1940 of these cave paintings. But this one critic I read was saying that those cave paintings obviously affected and influenced Fautrier, but I think it's clear from paintings like this from 1929, he was obviously, it emphasized what was already there. And this question of what's already there in the artist's artistic imagination, I'm fascinated by the way in which 20,000 years ago there is this continuity in the artistic imagination, that there's this continuum from way back, the deep caves of our minds. This is what art can do. And this relates back to the poem by Wallace Stevens, which I'll finish with at the very end. And hopefully as I go along, the significance of that poem will become clearer. So the point I want to underline is, if this is 1929, 11 years before those cave paintings were discovered in France, what is it that's in the nuanced subtlety of artistic representations that can stay, to some extent, continuous over such huge length of time? And then in Microcosm, this was just a sketch, crayon-type sketch that Fautrier did in 1959 to 60, so much later, not long before he died. But you can see how the basic shape, ignore the colour for a second, but the basic shape is obviously in there's continuity within his own career and his own artistic imagination. So I'm just going to show you some of the Lascaux and pictures, probably till you get fed up with me. But there's a reason, because it's this continuity I want to keep emphasizing between prehistoric paintings like this and later expressions of much 1940s. He was doing the hostage series in response to the horrors of German occupation in Paris and the people who had been taken hostage. And the story is, he was arrested, I think it was in 1943, by the Gestapo, and it turned out all right. After about 4 days he was released, and I'll explain later part of that process. But he was released because other people intervened. But he could have quite easily, when the Gestapo interrogated you, it wasn't often that you made it out again. So he really did confront his own mortality. And from that, he started to develop this hostage series. But in this instance, I want you to, that odd colouring from the rock. So there's various things. It's the way in which the rock and the human-made shapes interact. I think that's a feature of Fautrier's work. And you can see the way these shapes just come out of the rock. I think Morse described this in his notes, the photographer, a very important horse, and he said it may well be the first example anywhere of drawing in modern perspective. A rhinoceros type creature, which makes you wonder, were they romping around France 20,000 years ago? Now, just to make some direct comparisons, think this was hostage with the hostages with hands, I think was the title translated, or something like that. But I hope you'd accept, or I'm not going too far out on a limb, that these are obviously influenced by the use of. He's painted them on canvas using a paper mache type. I'll go into a future date the precise techniques. I'm not an artist, but I've read about how he did it with paper layered and then pigment, powder, and paint on top and varnish, and he built up the layers on top of the canvas. And also, there was a problem. It's in the 40s when getting art supplies was incredibly difficult. So I think at one time he was painting using canvas from the walls of his apartment. There's a close-up of that particular painting to give you an idea of the texture. So that's Fautrier's effort, and then look at this is, they reckon it's El Castillo from northern Spain, the Cantabrian seacoast. And it's disputed, they don't know for sure, but it's potentially Neanderthals. What they did was they'd take pigment into their mouths, and with something like a straw or a hollow, obviously not a modern straw, but you know what I mean, like a hollow twig, they'd blow, or just blowing it onto the back of their hands, they'd create handprints like stencils. And this is estimated at around 40,800 years old. So much older, twice as old as the Lascaux paintings. And then I think this is called Red Cow and First Chinese Horse. This was, they just obviously named various parts of the cave paintings in Lascaux. I'm just showing you this to repeat the tonality of the colours and the wall and the use of the shapes. That again is nu couché, the resting nude or lying down nude. And again, you've seen this, but this is the Great Black Bull. But I wanted to show you it again to show you the way in which the colour is used in Fautrier's later. This was 1943. And I hope it's not just me, I just see direct parallels. And then the idea that Fautrier used images that were very resonant with a cave wall. I think this is I think one of the best examples I can think of. So I've given you lots of examples of how I think there's a direct link to these prehistoric cave paintings. And just to reiterate, what this all has to do with ideology is there's an artistic expression that human beings want to engage with to make sense of the world around them. And I'm suggesting that in our day, there is hysterical ideology epitomized by that woman's face just screaming incontinently, that bears, it doesn't allow any nuance, it doesn't allow any engagement with complexity or context. So remember, one of the first headings I had was cowpats and context. Whereas to fully appreciate what Fautrier is doing, you need to put these images in the context of the prehistoric paintings to see that lineage, but also the contemporary situation Fautrier was in with regard to the German occupation, people being taken hostage, and the massacres. This is called the massacre from 1943. So the story was he took refuge. He was arrested by the Gestapo. It was I'll give you images of a German artist who happened to be Hitler's favourite sculptor, who was living in Paris, working in Paris. He intervened with the Gestapo because he was influential and managed to get Fautrier released. So he went away for a while, then he came back and he took refuge in a psychiatric hospital in the suburbs of Paris. Something like Châtenay-Malabry, I think it was. So it's this big old-fashioned sanatorium with high walls, and there's some dispute because I think the common legend is all of these type of paintings were influenced by the fact there were executions taking place on a nightly basis in the woods beyond the wall of the sanatorium. So he could hear the screams. And one of his biographers, it's quite I don't know how much to believe or how much of it's ad hominem, but there was one writer saying he seemed to take inordinate sadistic. He was too voyeuristically sadistic when he used to look over the wall and try and see whatever he could. Personally, if I was in that situation, I'd be terrified of getting caught by the Gestapo again, so I'd have kept my head down. But so there's the accusation that A, he was voyeuristic, and B, that he was already doing these type of images before he stayed at the sanatorium. So for sure, his stay at the sanatorium affected a lot of the images I'm going to show you, but one of the suggestions is he was already on that path anyway. Just like he was already on the path to cave-like paintings before the Lascaux cave paintings were discovered in 1940. And if you forgive the slight tangent, one of the things I really like about Fautrier's work is the way the images come out from the background. So I'm going to give you loads of examples of these type of cave painting adjacent type style. But early in his career, this is 1924, it's just called Interior, 3 People at a Table. And what I see is just some hint of some of the coming out of the wall that you get in the cave paintings. And this is the main Paris Avenue de Main in 1925. And then slight curveball, but this is the duck or the mallard, I think the translation is, from 1928. But this notion of an image coming out from this dark void, it's an odd subject, the duck or mallard. But he used this technique for human figures, which I find in a really eerie way. So this is the Petit Nude Noir, little black nude. And this is Head of a Woman, 1926. Blackhead, 1926. Petit Nu, 1926. La Jolie Fille, the jolly woman girl. And I think what I'm trying to use all these, and there's so many, and this is what happens with artists. It happened with Picasso and the concept of the bull and the Minotaur, where he did painting after painting after painting. And similarly, Fautrier does this when he gets a theme. I think when it comes to the heads and the hostage series, he numbered them. He very rarely gave them any personal names because he was trying to emphasize the relentless nature of the number of people who were killed in the German occupation and during the Second World War. But and likewise in these nudes, he makes sure there are no, they're not exactly personal faces. They're very indistinguishable, blurred. But the way in which the division between the figure and the foreground, there is a difference, but it's not defined particularly well, and you've got the light coming in from the left. Similarly, it's murky, it's nuanced, it's coming out from the depths of something. It's all the opposite of ideological hysteria that leaves no room for any subtlety. Everything has to be explicit. So these were earlier on, and then as the war progressed, this is the body of the hostage in 1943, and you can see how fragmented. It's like the trunk rather than the whole body. This is how his painting evolved. And I'd claim you still see, though, almost like the figure being an outgrowth of the rock, as in the cave paintings. And this is called Sarah from 1943. And at a future date, I can go into the complexity of the naming. This was, as I said, unusual that he gave a personal name. But actually, at the time, Sarah was used by the Germans as a generic name for a Jewish woman. It's Abraham's wife, Sarah, so it was used. And there's a story of how Abraham and Sarah, she was passed off as his sister to deceive the Pharaoh in Egypt. So this was used by the Germans to argue that the Jews were prone to use deceitful camouflage, and it was part of German propaganda against the Jews. So this is all, again, this is the background to fully appreciate and understand where Fautrier was coming from with images like this. And again, sorry to belabor the point, but contemporary media images do not have this type of context. They're much more self-contained and explicit. And I might be doing the lady from the screaming Trump derangement syndrome meme a disservice. And maybe I'm completely wrong, but I just would argue that if people spent more time engaging in art like this, I don't know, it would be interesting to get a properly trained psychologist on the case, but it strikes me that to give full justice to understanding art like this, it makes you slightly less prone to stand in a street screaming because you didn't get your own way in an election. So you've seen how when you did the nudes, they're still identifiably, although submerged in this misty effect, they're still identifiably female forms. And then I've just shown you a couple of images that are very truncated and mutilated almost. And then you get into this weird, I think this is the flayed, Lascaux, sorry. But he did, early on in his career, he did a series of animal, half opened up animals that were hanging, like hares and a boar. But this is like this indeterminate shape with human hands. But instead of, again, this the constant theme I'm trying to probably bore you senseless with, but the idea that there's a deliberate vagueness, there's a deliberate fragmentation, there's a deliberate breaking down. And again, in terms of understanding the context, when the Germans occupied Paris, the whole German philosophy was against what they called degenerate art. Everything had to be pure classical, and I'll give you examples in a second. But this was classed as degenerate art, and that's what Fautrier was still trying to oppose the German occupation, at least artistically, doing. So this is called La Juive, the Jewess, from 1943. So there's a vaguely human figure there in amongst the shape. But this concept of the fragmented shape, it's not a whole person. This is the commentary he's making. Body of Hostage, this is called, 1943 to 44. And there's a close-up of just to give you a sense of the texture. And this is the guy, Arno Breker. He was Hitler's favourite sculptor. And you can see him busy at work. And this was just the classical, quite staid, safe as anything. But this is obviously much more to the German leader's taste. But this is how funny life works out. This was the guy who helped rescue Fautrier from the Gestapo. And there was another coincidence. His future wife at the time, so I think it was 43, Fautrier was arrested by the Gestapo. In 1925, Fautrier painted Brecker's wife-to-be called Minima. So he hadn't married her yet. I'm not even sure they'd met, but she eventually married this guy. And these are other examples of Brecker's work. So if nothing else, it should be clear how different this is to what Fautrier was trying to produce. And this is called Piaget traps. That's a close-up. And then I remember seeing this for the first time, and my immediate thought was that it was quite. I thought at the time it was quite a leap. That reminded me of Turner's work. And then I found out when he was in London, one of the first major influences on Fautrier was Turner's work. I think you get a hint of it. This is, and I'm definitely doing a video or two in future on Turner. You'll be glad to hear, or not glad to hear, as the case may be. But this is Snowstorm Steamboat off a harbour's mouth from 1842. Such a relief to be able to pronounce the title of a painting without feeling self-conscious, or Emma's going to shout at me. This is, and I'm sorry to preempt any future discussion of Turner, but this is 1832, and this just is so avant-garde for its time. This is sea, sky, and English coast. And just by way of comparison, I appreciate they're not direct comparison, but this is called Lilac Blue, and this is in Fautrier's late stages in 1959. But there's just something about the painting style that I think you can see the influence. This is Deep Blue from 1961. It's not quite as thick as Auerbach and his layers and layers of impasto technique, but it is pretty thick. And then just to explain, this is from one of Turner's notebooks, sketchbooks, I should say. So you can see in the left hand side, that's the spine of the sketchbook. On the left is a blank page. And this is Storm at Sea from 1822 to 3. And it always intrigues me the extent to which, you know, I dabble in art, but I'm no art expert by any means. But without trying to big myself up, like, it's just repeat, I'm not claiming to be any art expert, but the fact I could see Turner's influence in Fautrier's early work and late work, I'm pretty sure if I'd have seen this, I'd have immediately thought, even from just such a basic sketch, it's so automatically your mind says Turner. To have that level of, in such a relatively simple painting, to have that signature style. And maybe an even better example is this. This is Storm at Sea, a study from around about, they think, 1825. But you can just see the hints of his later, much more developed work. This is Sea and Sky, 1820 to 30. But back to the cave paintings to give this idea of how, in the Turner and the Fautrier, the images seem to come out of the background. So they've labelled these small horses, slightly magnified. And the way they just come out of the rock. This is Le Fusilet, the gun down from 1943. I'm just now going to intersperse some cave paintings with some Fautrier and to compare and contrast. This is referred to as the third Chinese horse. This is Head of a Hostage number 8. And it's just the shape at the top reminds me of the type of, obviously they're just working on the rock, so you know the way the rock evolved over time and becomes a natural part of the appearance of the paintings. These are referred to as back-to-back bison. And this is just another one of the Head of a Hostage series. And apologies if you find it just quite repetitive, but this was actually part of, I think, Fautrier's purpose, to emphasize the repetitive nature, just the obscene, endless number of people who were killed. And maybe I am, we've established in previous videos, I'm very odd, but I could look at these different types of images over and over, which I do, having made you do it as well. But just like the way the black is used, you know, it's some type of eye, but it could be a wound. There's the squiggle at the bottom that could be a mouth. It's just very elusive and vague. And this is known as horse falling backward. But I like the way, you know, 20,000 years ago, the fragmentary nature. This is almost like abstract art ahead of its time. And I think this is called Profile 1943, but this is one of the best examples if you're going to claim Fautrier was imitating cave paintings. This is one of the most resonant for me. And this is called the scene of the dead man, is how it's referred to. Obviously, the Cro-Magnons or whoever was painting these didn't name it. Might be dead, but he seems quite excited, chap. And this is, he did a, I'll show you another one after this, but this is almost like a combination of different styles, but this is Head of Hostage number 4 from 1944, but there's more figurative on the outside, and then there's the cave painting type influence in the middle, and it achieves a slightly different effect. Le Jolie Fille, 1944. And then pay attention, I think they're fingerprints on the left, or fingerprint-like shapes, because that becomes relevant right towards the end of this talk. This is Head of Hostage number 20. And this was one of the few that he actually named specifically. This was Orador su Glan, I think, 1945. It was, you might have heard of it in different formats, but it was a church where all the villagers were rounded up and the Germans burnt the church down with everyone in it. So it was one of the most horrific aspects for the French of the Second World War. So you can just make out the faces that are coming out from the image. So there's that subtlety, and then he more explicit. Well, it's explicit and vague at the same time. And then I just wanted to show you this one for the texture. It's one of the better examples of the Frank Auerbach-like texture, the depth of it. And again with the fingerprints on the left-hand side. And this is head of hostage number 10. So as you're probably getting the sense by now, he did an awful lot. And I think in the 1930s he destroyed the Great Depression was on. You just think of the life. He was an illegitimate child. He had to go to London. He had to come back, fight in the First World War. Then there was the massive depression. Then he had to undergo the Second World War, arrested by the Gestapo. So at various times he just gave up painting completely. And like I said, in the 1930s, I think he just sadly destroyed a large number of his own paintings. And then it becomes more abstract again. So just to give you the close-up detail. And it's hard to say I've got a favourite, but this is potentially... This is called Monsieur Tarabouste. And Tarabouste means to pester, to plague, or to worry someone. And this is 1948, so it's towards the end of the whole Head of Hostage series. And I think it's a fitting name because this theme, obviously, just the sheer number I've shown you, the pester, the plague. He was artistically worried. He couldn't get out of his head, so he kept painting. Which I'd argue quite strongly is much more productive and has given posterity much more than standing in a luminous coat and a beanie and screaming like a primeval rabid wolf. And then just to explain, this might look, as for some of you, as boring as the Head of Hostage series, but this is from a series called L'Objet, the object, and it's Le Pain, the bread, from 1947. And you think, well, why has he painted a not very realistic loaf of bread? And then you realise after the war, 47, food was scarce, and part of Fautrier's subjects were everyday objects. And it was also a time where Sartre, Husserl, Heidegger, all these people had been writing about existentialism and phenomenology, which is the philosophy about the nature of objects. So you're half starving to death, and he applied his technique to just representing everyday objects. I haven't had my dinner yet. But this is some of the detail. I'll start to finish off with this Le Verre Vide, Empty Glass from 1955. So after all those pictures, I wanted to summarise by showing you something that has nothing to do with massacres, nothing to do with executions or death. What could be more mundane and banal than an empty glass? But this, I wanted to go back to the poem from the very beginning, which I will now argue, I think, relates to it. It can be interpreted in lots of ways. I'm not claiming I have the monopoly on how to interpret the Wallace Stevens poem. But if you can focus, keep that in your mind's eye. The Wallace Stevens anecdote of the jar. My interpretation, and this is what I'd be interested in, having seen at the very beginning of the talk, now looking at it now, having been subjected to all those images, image after image after image from Fautrier, the way in which I'm going to claim this poem is all about the way in which human beings, you can argue it's been interpreted as some type of commentary, critical commentary about industrialization, the way in which we impose order on nature. And yes, it's definitely a way to read it, but would ask you to think of it in a slightly different way. It's the way in which art imposes, just like the prehistoric cave people were painting in the bowels of the earth, deep, the dark caverns of our minds. They were replicating in caves deep under the ground. That's the upside of the order that human beings, through art, try to impose. But as I've been arguing all the way through, we use that meaning in a nuanced, artistic, representative way, not the closed off ideological way of screaming because you don't get your own way. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. I think after seeing all these images, or I've been looking at these images for a long time now, it clicked with me. That's, if I was going to pick an image to illustrate the Wallace Stevens poem, it would be this. And I think it's a bit more uplifting. It's very rare for me to be optimistic or uplifting, but it's more uplifting than to interpret the Wallace Stevens poem as only the negative side of the way human beings impose order on nature. Deep in the bowels of the earth, and with art like this, it's a continuum throughout history that human beings have used art for much more productive, expressive purposes. And faced with, so this is the massacres from 1944, faced with the horror of what happened in occupied France and beyond, there's a physicality and abstractness that Fautrier produced. And I always think the fingerprints around the outside, this is one of those most explicit use of the fingerprints motif, but it's like the phrase, has our fingerprints or has his fingerprints all over it. This is the complicity. And maybe at a future date get into the whole notion of Vichy France, the way they cooperated and collaborated with the Germans. There's a national guilt which may at least partially explain why for a long time Fautrier didn't get the recognition within France I think he deserved, because he's portraying something that people would rather forget. So with all that in mind, I hope to go back to the very original painting that I contrasted with the screaming Trump derangement syndrome person. I hope that this image that I'll finish with makes a bit more sense and you don't see it as a cowpat anymore. So till the next time, all the very best. Take care.